Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for dramatic and emotional storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to actual people, places, or events is purely coincidental. The plot contains mature themes, including infidelity, and is intended for an adult audience. The narrative aims to explore human emotions, relationships, and moral dilemmas, not to encourage or condone any unethical behavior. Reader discretion is advised. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the ticking of the clock feels louder than usual. Emily sat curled up on the couch, the soft fabric of her sweater bunched up under her chin, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. Her shoulders ached from the tension of the past week, a tension that no amount of stretching seemed to fix. Her husband, Mark, was away on yet another business trip, leaving the house feeling both too large and too silent. She had been scrolling aimlessly on her phone when the doorbell rang. Standing there was Ryan, Mark's oldest friend, with his easy smile and a grocery bag dangling from one hand. He had dropped by to return the toolbox he had borrowed last week. They chatted briefly, small talk about the weather and the neighborhood, until his gaze flicked to the way she was rotating her neck, trying to ease the stiffness. "You look like you're in pain," Ryan said, setting the bag on the kitchen counter. She laughed lightly, brushing it off, but he didn't. "Seriously, you've been tense since I walked in. Want me to help? I give pretty good shoulder massages." It was such an innocent offer on the surface, wrapped in the safety of years of friendship. Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning his face for any trace of mischief, but all she saw was a calm, open expression. "Just to loosen the tension," he added, almost reading her thoughts. She gave a small nod, more from exhaustion than anything else, and turned slightly so he could reach her shoulders. At first, his touch was exactly what she expected: firm, practiced, nothing out of place. The kind of massage a friend might give without thinking twice. His hands pressed into the tight muscles along her neck, drawing out the knots one by one. Emily let out a small sigh, her eyes fluttering shut, grateful for the relief. The room was warm, the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air from earlier, and for a while, it was simply comforting. She could almost forget the quiet loneliness that had been her companion since Mark left. But then, as the minutes passed, there was something different. The pressure of his thumbs lingered just a fraction too long in one spot. His fingertips brushed against her skin in a way that felt deliberate. She told herself she was imagining it, that it was just her mind wandering, but the shift in the air was undeniable. The ticking clock seemed to slow. Her breath became shallow, matching the steady rhythm of his hands. She didn't move away, not yet. And in that moment, without her realizing it, a door was opening. A door she didn't even know was in the room until now. At first, Emily told herself it was just her imagination, the strange awareness creeping up her spine, the faint electricity in the way Ryan's fingers traced the curve of her neck. She kept her eyes closed, focusing on the sound of the clock in the living room and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But even those familiar sounds seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet heaviness that settled between them. His hands moved slower now, each press of his thumbs deliberate, lingering as though memorizing the feel of her. She swallowed hard, unsure if she should speak, unsure even of what she would say if she did. There was nothing overt in his touch, not yet, but it had shifted from something purely functional into something charged. It wasn't the same as a stranger's hand at a spa, detached and professional. This was different. This was personal. His fingers drifted lower along her shoulder blades, the heat of his palms seeping through the thin fabric of her sweater. The contact sent a wave of warmth over her, and she hated that it felt good, that she didn't want him to stop. Ryan's breathing had changed too. It was slower, heavier, and somehow she felt it more than she heard it. A warmth radiated off him, and even though he was standing just behind her, she felt the space between them shrinking. She became aware of every detail: the faint scent of his cologne, the scrape of his fingertips against the knit fabric, the almost imperceptible pause before each new motion. The air felt thicker, as if they were both breathing something different now, something weighted with unspoken thought. "You're really tense," he murmured, his voice low enough that it felt like it was meant for her alone, not the casual tone of friendly conversation. She forced a small laugh, hoping to defuse whatever this was, but the sound came out too thin, too nervous. "Yeah, I guess I just haven't been sleeping well," she said, her voice shaky. He hummed in response, a soft, almost approving sound, and his hands pressed deeper, coaxing a sigh from her lips she hadn't intended to give. The sound made her cheeks flush, and she was grateful he couldn't see her face. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice screamed at her to stop this before it became something it shouldn't. But another voice, quieter, more dangerous, whispered that maybe it was harmless. After all, nothing had happened. Not yet. Still, the way he touched her now wasn't the same as when he started. And though she didn't turn to look at him, she could feel the weight of his gaze, as though he was studying her reaction, measuring how far he could go before she told him to stop. She didn't realize it yet, but in those slow, deliberate motions, the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. Emily tried to convince herself that this was still fine, still friendly, still within the safe boundaries they'd always had. But then Ryan spoke again, and his words didn't feel safe at all. "You know," he said softly, "I've always noticed how you hold yourself when you're stressed. Even the way you breathe changes." His hands kept working into her muscles, but the weight of his statement made her tense in an entirely new way. She forced a little laugh, hoping to brush it off. "You've been studying me?" she teased, aiming for light-hearted, but missing the mark completely. He didn't laugh. "Not studying," he said after a pause, "just noticing." The way he said it, low, deliberate, and almost hesitant, made her stomach tighten. He wasn't talking about posture anymore. Her mind raced back through years of friendship, backyard barbecues, game nights, quick visits to borrow tools or return books. Ryan had always been easygoing, a steady presence in their lives. She'd never once thought of him in any way other than her husband's best friend. But now, every one of those past moments felt different in hindsight, as if there had been something there all along and she had simply never chosen to see it. His fingers pressed firmly into a knot in her shoulder, pulling a reluctant sigh from her lips. "That's better," he murmured, almost as though he were pleased to be the one giving her that release. The sound of his voice sent an unwelcome shiver through her. She was suddenly aware of how close he was standing, how easily he could lean down and be within inches of her ear. The air between them seemed charged, like a storm waiting to break. Emily knew she should stop this, say something about how her husband wouldn't like it, or how this was making her uncomfortable. But the words caught in her throat. Part of her was curious. Curious about how far he would go, about whether this tension was real or just in her head. "You've been carrying too much," Ryan said quietly, his hands slowing. "Mark doesn't see it, but I do." That was the moment the first crack appeared in the wall she'd built between them. It wasn't the touch, not yet, it was the implication in his words, the suggestion that he saw her in a way her husband didn't. That he understood something about her that no one else did. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She didn't move away. Instead, she let him keep his hands on her shoulders, feeling the heat of them seep deeper into her skin. In the back of her mind, she knew that once the first crack appeared, the rest of the wall would be much easier to break. The silence in the room felt different now, heavier, thicker, as if the air itself knew they had stepped across some invisible threshold. Ryan's hands moved slowly down her back, his fingers spreading, tracing the line of her shoulder blades before pausing at the edge of where her sweater dipped. It wasn't overtly inappropriate, not yet, but it wasn't where a friend's hands usually belonged either. Emily's breath caught, and she wasn't sure if it was from surprise or something else entirely. She told herself again that it could be accidental. Maybe he was just working out the knots. Maybe she was overthinking. But the truth was in the way his fingers lingered, the way they didn't retreat right away, the way they pressed lightly as though testing boundaries. Her skin seemed to hum beneath his touch, every nerve awake and alert. Without realizing it, she leaned forward slightly, giving him more room. It wasn't a conscious choice, at least that's what she told herself, but the moment she did it, she felt the shift. His touch deepened, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles. He was no longer pretending this was only about relieving tension. This was something else. Something intimate. She risked a glance over her shoulder. His eyes met hers instantly, as though he'd been waiting for her to look. There was no friendliness there now, no casual banter. Instead, there was heat, a hunger she recognized even though she'd never seen it from him before. That single moment of locked eyes felt like an unspoken confession. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears. She could pull away now. She could stand, laugh it off, change the subject, and they'd both pretend it never happened. But she didn't. Neither of them moved. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them taking a step. Ryan's hands shifted again, sliding lower, not far, but enough to make her heart skip. It was still within the realm of accidental, but they both knew it wasn't. The contact was deliberate, lingering, his fingers brushing just enough for her to feel the truth in it. Her breath came faster, shallower, her mind screaming that this was wrong while her body betrayed her, leaning subtly into his touch. Every part of her was aware of him now, the warmth of his hands, the faint scent of his cologne, the quiet way he exhaled as his fingers traced over her. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The silence between them said everything, that the boundaries had shifted, that this was no longer innocent, and that whatever came next would be a choice. A choice she wasn't sure she wanted to make, but one she knew was already being made for her, in the subtle movements of his hands. And in that moment, Emily understood. A simple massage had become something else entirely. Emily's thoughts were a tangled mess, flashes of Mark's face, the vows they'd made, and the years they'd built together clashing against the heat pooling low in her stomach. She told herself she was still in control, that she could stop this whenever she wanted. But deep down, she knew the balance had already tipped. Ryan's hands slowed until they were simply resting on her shoulders, the weight of them almost heavier than the motion had been. The pause stretched long enough that she finally glanced back at him again. His eyes were fixed on her, not in a way that was casual or playful, but with a kind of intensity that made it hard for her to breathe. "Emily." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but there was a rawness in it that caught her off guard. "I shouldn't say this, but I've been in love with you for years." Her heart lurched violently in her chest. She blinked, certain she'd misheard him. "Ryan." He shook his head quickly, as if trying to get the words out before she could stop him. "I never said anything because of Mark. You're his. You've always been his. But I can't stand here, touching you like this, and keep pretending I don't feel it." Emily's mouth went dry. There were 100 things she could have said, to tell him he was wrong, to tell him to leave, to tell him she loved her husband. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat frozen, her pulse pounding so loud she could barely hear anything else. "You don't have to say anything," Ryan continued, his thumbs brushing lightly against her collarbones now, just above where the neckline of her sweater dipped. I needed you to know." Her chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, and the familiar comfort of her living room had vanished entirely. She was aware of the way his hands were still touching her, aware of the warmth spreading from those points of contact, aware that she hadn't moved away. It was dangerous, the way his words had cut through her defenses more sharply than any touch could have. He wasn't just a pair of hands offering comfort anymore. He was someone who saw her, wanted her, and wasn't afraid to admit it. And though she knew it was wrong, there was something intoxicating in that. She should have stood up. She should have told him to leave. She should have ended it right there. But instead, she stayed seated, her back still to him, her mind spinning with the weight of what he'd just said. And when his fingers moved again, this time slower, gentler, she didn't stop him. The moment hung in the air like a held breath, as if the house itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Emily sat perfectly still, her body caught between the instinct to move away and the dangerous pull to lean back into him. She could feel his warmth behind her, close enough that if she tilted her head even slightly, her cheek would brush against his chest. Ryan's hands slid from her shoulders down her arms in one slow, unbroken motion, his fingertips tracing the fabric of her sweater. The motion was intimate, deliberate, and it made her skin burn beneath the layers. When his hands reached her wrists, he didn't let go. He lingered, his thumbs rubbing gentle circles as if memorizing the shape of her. "Emily," he murmured again, and there was something in his tone, not a question, not even a plea, but an invitation. Her breath hitched. She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, and in that instant, everything else fell away. There was no mark, no history, no consequences. Only the two of them, suspended in that charged silence. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was quick at first, almost tentative, but the second their mouths touched, it deepened. Her heart raced wildly, her fingers tightening around his forearm without thinking. The kiss wasn't just about attraction, it was years of unspoken feelings, all breaking free in a single moment. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, both breathing hard. "We can't," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction. "I know," he replied softly. "But I can't stop." Neither of them moved away. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch, letting herself feel it, the danger, the wrongness, the thrill. His lips found hers again, slower this time, more deliberate, his other hand sliding to her waist. She felt herself melting into him, the boundary between them dissolving completely. Every rational thought screamed that this was the point of no return. That if she didn't stop now, there would be no undoing it. But her body had already made the decision her mind was too afraid to admit. When his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him, she didn't resist. The massage was long forgotten. This was no longer about easing sore muscles. This was about something they had both been pretending didn't exist for far too long. And as their lips met again, more urgently this time, Emily knew the line had been crossed. Whatever happened after this moment, they could never go back to the way things were. The kiss ended not with a decision, but with the weight of reality pressing between them. Emily pulled back first, her chest heaving, her lips tingling from the heat they'd just shared. Ryan's hands lingered on her waist for a moment before slowly retreating, as if even letting go was an effort he had to force. Neither of them spoke. The silence that followed was louder than any words could have been. Emily turned away, her eyes darting toward the floor as if she might find an answer there. Her heart still raced, but now each thump carried the echo of guilt. Her sweater felt too warm, her skin too aware, and she wrapped her arms around herself as if she could hide from what they had just done. The room seemed smaller now, its walls holding in the heat of the moment like a secret neither of them wanted to keep, yet couldn't erase. Ryan ran a hand through his hair and let out a shaky breath. I should go," he muttered, his voice lower than before. Emily only nodded, afraid that if she spoke, her voice would betray the mess of emotions twisting inside her. He gathered his things quickly, not meeting her eyes, and walked toward the door. But just before leaving he paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I'm sorry," he said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "We won't talk about this." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound felt final in a way that made her chest ache. Emily stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the empty space he'd left, her mind replaying every second, the look in his eyes, the feel of his hands, the heat of his breath against her lips. She sank onto the couch, curling her knees up to her chest. The TV was off, but in the dark reflection of the screen, she saw herself, the same woman she'd been this morning, and yet completely different. She thought of Mark, of his easy trust, of the way he never questioned her when he left for his trips. That trust was now a fragile thing, one she had cracked with her own hands. The guilt came in waves, but so did something else, a lingering ache for the way Ryan had touched her, the way he had looked at her as if she was the only person in the world. That thought alone made her stomach twist in both shame and longing. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed on the street, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, and somewhere, far away, her husband was probably wrapping up a meeting without a clue about what had unfolded in their living room. Emily closed her eyes and tried to breathe. But the air felt different now, heavier, as though it carried the weight of a secret that would follow her no matter how hard she tried to forget. 3 days passed in a haze of restless sleep and nervous glances at her phone. Emily hadn't heard from Ryan, and part of her was grateful. The silence felt like a fragile thread keeping the moment from becoming something bigger. But the other part of her replayed that afternoon over and over, wondering if he was thinking about it too. Mark came home on a Thursday evening, suitcase in hand and a smile on his face, leaning in to kiss her as though nothing had changed. His touch felt different to her now, not because he had changed, but because she had. Guilt prickled her skin beneath every affectionate gesture, and she found herself pulling away sooner than usual. They settled into the kitchen, where he unpacked a small box of chocolates from his trip. "Oh, by the way," he said casually, "Ryan stopped by when I was gone, right?" Emily's pulse jumped. "Yeah, he just came to drop something off," she said, forcing her voice to stay even. Mark gave her a little smile, unwrapping a piece of chocolate. "He mentioned you looked really relaxed when he saw you." The words were light, almost teasing, but his eyes lingered on her a moment too long. It was enough to send a jolt of panic through her. She laughed, too quickly, too high-pitched, and reached for a glass of water to avoid his gaze. "Well, I guess the tea I made helped," she said, but the lie tasted bitter in her mouth. Mark didn't press, but there was something in the way he watched her that made her chest tighten. A flicker of suspicion? Or was it just her guilt projecting what she feared most? That night, long after Mark had fallen asleep beside her, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind spun with questions. Did Ryan say anything else to him? Was he testing her? How much did Mark know? And most dangerous of all, did she even want the truth to stay hidden? A part of her longed to bury it, to never speak of that afternoon again. But another part, a darker, more restless part, knew the truth was hanging over her like a storm cloud. Sooner or later, it would break. She rolled onto her side, watching Mark breathe evenly in the dim light. The man she had promised everything to lay just inches away, trusting her completely. And yet, in the quiet, she felt worlds apart from him. As she closed her eyes, one thought lingered, heavy and undeniable. Whether the truth came out tomorrow or years from now, nothing between them would ever be the same again. 1.